Regina.
Let's pray. Mungu anayewakaribisha watu wote, fungua mioyo yetu ili tuwakumbatie watu wote kama unavyofanya wewe. God who welcomes all, open our hearts to embrace all people as you do. Amen.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another day of the African Diaspora Conference. This year, 2021, we're focusing on the theme From Manchester 1945 to a Pan-African Renaissance. This brings together a number of Pan-African initiatives across the world to congregate, exchange, and build a Pan-Africanism for the future. We have representatives from all over the world, from Africa, the Caribbean, Europe, Asia, and Oceania, both from civil society and political institutions. My name is Michael Cooper Ocheng, and I will be going through the proceedings today with you. I will let my colleague introduce himself.
Good morning. It is good to be here with you today and to share in this special event. My name is Reverend Algernon Lewis. I am chairman of the Moravian Church, East and West Indies Province. And together with Mr. Cooper Ocheng from Trinidad, we will be co-chairing today. I am speaking to you from the Caribbean Twin Island nation of Antigua and Barbuda.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lewis. So we know that these sessions have been jam-packed, full of much insightful information and discussions. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our feature presentation this morning. We have Dr. Natalia Kanem, who is the Executive Director of the United Nations Population Fund, UNFPA. This is the United Nations Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights Agency. It was appointed by the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, in 2017. Dr. Kanem has more than 30 years of strategic leadership experience in the fields of preventive medicine, public and reproductive health, social justice, and philanthropy. She started her research career in academia with the Johns Hopkins and Columbia University Schools of Medicine and Public Health. We welcome Dr. Kanem.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, esteemed elders, dear friends. It was the great Pan-Africanist Marcus Mosiah Garvey who stated that progress is the attraction that moves humanity. Today's theme, Pan-Africanism, with all and for all, has special resonance for me as a member of Africa's 6th region, the diverse and dynamic African diaspora. From the Americas to the Pacific, from Asia to Europe and beyond, we form a living testament to human resilience and to the force of will to freedom. I congratulate Reverend Frank Chikane and all the organizers. It's my honor to be with you, speaking as a woman of African descent born in Panama, and as the leader of UNFPA, the United Nations Sexual and Reproductive Health Agency, working in over 150 locations around the world to uphold the rights, choices, and dignity of women and girls and everyone. At the United Nations, this is our unwavering promise towards the year 2030. Achieve the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and leave no one behind. Making good on that promise must mean redress for centuries of racism, discrimination, and exclusion faced by people of African descent. It must mean securing self-determination and decent livelihoods for all Indigenous peoples, for our Aboriginal family to the south, for migrants and refugees and displaced people, for people living with disabilities and anyone else who is discounted, made invisible, exists at the margins. In the spirit of Pan-Africanism, the promise of Agenda 2030 and of the African Union's Agenda 2063 towards the Africa we want will mean recognizing our immense contributions to the advancement of human achievement, our ingenuity, our resilience, and our shared interests and common values as a people. Celebrating our diverse heritage reaffirms our unity and our beautiful culture that gladdens the soul. Our culture forms our resilient outlook, and all around the world, it continually serves as an inspiration to our wonderful young geniuses of African descent. On August 31st this year, history was made as the United Nations and the world observed the first ever International Day for People of African Descent. I marked that historic day with the strong Afrodescendiente community of Cahuita in Costa Rica. There, we declared a symbolic door of return, signaling the start of a new and triumphant chapter following the era of transatlantic enslavement and the intentional underdevelopment of Africa, one of the bleakest chapters in human history. As Walter Rodney and Lloyd Best and so many others have shown, that legacy of racism and criminal injustice is still very much with us today. And now, as Africa and its diaspora are beset by the ravages of the coronavirus pandemic, let's all be reminded that in addressing delegates at the Durban Conference Against Racism 20 years ago, President Nelson Mandela said, "Racism is an ailment of the mind and the soul. It kills many more than any contagion," end quote. And there in Durban, we also saw the power of rural women and their insistence on voice, inclusion, and self-determination as they gathered to state their case. Nzinga, Nana Ya Asantewa, Sobe Kneferu, and Hatshepsut, Nanny of the Maroons, Dahomey warriors, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Mariama Ba, Funmilayo Ransom Kuti, Fannie Lou Hamer, Dorothy Height, Shirley Chisholm, Angela Davis, Toni Morrison, Mariam Makeba, my grandmothers, your foremothers. Bow your head because the list goes on, and it is high time for women of Africa and of African descent, known and unknown, to be hailed as the fearless leaders and brilliant strategists they were and are up until today. The 2001 Durban Declaration lifts up Black women alongside the far-reaching programs of action forged by UNFPA in Cairo in 1994 for population and development, and by the world's women in the Beijing Declaration of 1995. These principles of fairness and equity and leadership for women are part of our Pan-African guiding lights, our Black Star line. Along with the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, UNFPA enthusiastically welcomes the Permanent Forum for People of African Descent, newly created unanimously by the member states of the United Nations General Assembly. The Permanent Forum builds on alliances with the groundbreaking Permanent Forum for Indigenous Peoples. Coming 20 long years after Durban and a year after the killing of Mr. George Floyd, the new Permanent Forum for People of African Descent is a victory for Pan-Africanism and a much-needed platform for dialogue and resolution of pressing matters of import. I hope it will be constituted swiftly and then immediately used to confront all forms of racism and discrimination and to liberate the full realization of African and Afrodescendiente human rights. What I would especially want to see is for this permanent forum to guide member states to focus on the needs of vulnerable women and girls of African descent. It's an inexcusable fact that all indicators bear out. Everywhere on Earth, it is Black women and Black little girls who suffer the worst experiences of ill health, of violence and neglect, of poor nutrition, and of economic and social instability. For it is women and girls of African descent who bear the weight of both racism and sexism. It is they who are too often denied reproductive justice and bodily autonomy, the right to choose what happens to their own bodies, who too often are married too young, and victimized and misled in their ignorance about intimacy and human sexuality. They are more likely to be traumatized by female genital mutilation, violence, trafficking, and exploitation, more likely to be underemployed or unemployed, regardless of level of education, and 3 to 4 times more likely to die in childbirth. The burden is too heavy. Women want men and boys to be prominent, outspoken allies in the outcry against both racism and gender-based violence, against rape and conflict, and coercion of any sort. Men must stand with women's demand for peace. Peace in their countries and villages and communities, and especially peace in their homes. Today, COVID-19 exposes the injustices for all to see. Communities of color and Indigenous peoples suffer disproportionately. Despite the valiant efforts of the World Health Organization, Africa continues to be denied fair access to COVID-19 vaccines. Well, UNFPA has a proud history of standing up for equal rights and dignity for all, and for the right of every woman to access modern contraception so she can plan her family, give birth safely, and certainly live free from violence. We address data gaps. We work with partners to build communities of practice to ensure more inclusive health systems and services that serve women and young people with the quality of care that they deserve. We know that tackling the root causes of racism is key for real and lasting change, and that must happen now, not 25 years hence. Last year, UNFPA co-launched an important study regarding Afro-descendants and the matrix of social inequality in Latin America. More and more, we will help bring this type of statistical and economic evidence to bear on decisions about funding and services for communities of African descent. Information is power. Dear friends, Marcus Mosiah Garvey also famously said, "Up, up, ye mighty race. You can accomplish what you will." During this International Decade for People of African Descent, let us use our power. Let us wield our influence as protectors of human rights and promoters of equality to amplify the voices of all oppressed Black people everywhere. My pledge is to work together with you to ensure equal access to health, in particular sexual and reproductive health services, so that every 10-year-old girl in Africa and each and every 10-year-old girl across its vibrant diaspora in all corners of the world will know that she has rights. She has power. She has a noble cultural heritage. She will look at her reflection and recognize her immense beauty. And she will feel secure in the knowledge that all of us are deployed to remove every obstacle in her path, to support her, to navigate her adolescence safely, and to complete her education so she grows up strong, she prospers, and she has a bright and healthy future. Ours is a historic and just struggle for full equality and full dignity. Ours is a movement towards peace, development, human rights, and justice for Africa and for people of African descent everywhere. A luta continua. There is no turning back. we move forward. Thank you. Muchas gracias. Merci.
Thank you so much for that message, Dr. Kane. Thank you for those warm words. Thank you for that, taking us through that journey to highlight the many struggles that have brought us to this International Decade of Peoples of African Descent. Thank you for bringing a message on behalf of the United Nations Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights Agency, and pressing all of us to focus on the needs of women and vulnerable girls who bear the brunt of racism and sexism. We must all stand up with our women for peace. Thank you once again, Dr. Kane. Reverend Lewis.
Good morning again. Our next speaker, I'm afraid I do not have all the information on her, is Saharai Gomez. And this is a voice from Cuba. As we know that Cuba has been long marginalized by the international community in some regard, and yet has done very well in keeping itself going forward. And so we look forward to hearing from this next speaker. So I will introduce Saharai Gomez. I think that's what my sheet says. I think I'm seeing something else. Is that, can somebody correct me, please?
So Sarahi is not available. So instead we will be having Mr. Henry Tolsman. So we'll be listening to Mr. Henry Tolsman this morning.
Sorry.
Et membres de ce grand mouvement panafricain, chers téléspectateurs, je me sens très honoré aujourd'hui de participer à ce grand événement portant sur le panafricanisme. Que ces temps d'échange soit, pour nous tous, un temps fort de renouvellement de notre solidarité en tant que fils et filles d'Afrique. Je souhaite que ce soit un temps de confirmation de notre politique de fraternisation et de notre vision du monde. Tous pour un pour tous. À ce grand congrès, moi, Henri-Claude Télusma, je vous apporte la voix d'Haïti, la voix de la première république nègre du monde, la voix de la mère de la liberté, la voix de celle qui a jeté les premiers jalons aboutissant à l'abolition de l'esclavage dans le monde, la voix d'Haïti, pays qui a longé la main au monde entier, à tous ceux qui avaient soif de la justice, de la liberté et de l'indépendance. Mes chers amis, je dois vous rappeler franchement que cette voix d'Haïti n'est plus joyeuse, elle n'est plus rythmique, étant donné que la mère de la justice a soif de justice aujourd'hui. La mère de la libération d'esclaves est en quête d'indépendance. Le bastion du respect de la personne humaine souffre aujourd'hui de la traite des hommes. Oui, Haïti est prise au piège. Elle est piégée par ses amis, piégée par ses enfants et oubliée par sa mère, l'Afrique. C'est un très lourd fardeau pour moi aujourd'hui de porter cette voix si sombre, si triste, si désespérée à ce congrès si chaleureux, si enthousiasmé. La voix d'Haïti, c'est la voix de chaque Haïtien vivant tant en Haïti qu'à l'étranger. Je me fais donc le porte-parole de Philippe, cet Haïtien qui vit en Europe depuis plus de 10 ans et que l'insécurité l'empêche de revenir au pays pour passer du temps avec sa famille. Haïti est classé aujourd'hui parmi les pays les plus dangereux de la planète. J'apporte aussi les complaintes de Jacqueline, jeune fille de 26 ans qui a été kidnappée chez elle, torturée et violée en présence de son mari. Mon message à ce congrès cette année est aussi celui de Marie, épouse de policier, dont son mari a été lynché et brûlé en pleine rue. La voix d'Haïti est aujourd'hui celle de l'Incifort, un jeune homme qui vient de perdre son père. Son père est mort lors d'une opération chirurgicale à cause du manque de carburant dans le groupe électrogène de l'hôpital. Le temps me manque pour parler du petit Peterson qui ne peut pas aller à l'école parce que son école est transformée en tanière de bandits et de gangs. De Josué qui est forcé de fermer son entreprise par peur d'être rançonné une énième fois par les bandits. De Francisque, pasteur protestant, qui abandonne ses fidèles par peur d'être kidnappé en plein culte d'adoration. Malgré ma limite par rapport au temps, je dois quand même souligner que la voix d'Haïti à ce congrès est celle de Sophie, jeune fille qui croit qu'Haïti, c'est la grande oubliée de l'histoire, oubliée malgré son rôle dans le respect de la personne humaine, oubliée malgré son rôle dans l'indépendance de beaucoup de pays à travers le monde. Elle croit qu'Haïti est oubliée malgré son rôle dans la création de l'ONU, oubliée malgré son apport dans la création de beaucoup de nations, oubliée malgré son rôle dans l'accueil de plusieurs milliers d'immigrés persécutés dans leur pays pour des positions politiques, ethniques ou religieuses. Elle pense qu'Haïti est surtout rejeté par sa mère, l'Afrique. Je profite donc de ce congrès pour demander à cette grande population panafricaine de penser à l'Afrique de l'Amérique, de penser à Haïti. Haïti ne peut pas descendre plus bas, car il n'y a pas pire que l'enfer. Les Haïtiens connaissent aujourd'hui une rareté de vie. La vie n'existe pas. L'État n'existe pas. La justice n'existe pas. On n'en peut plus. Au nom de l'esprit et de la vision du monde panafricaine, je demande aujourd'hui à ce congrès action pour Haïti de la part de Seigneur Afrique. Une action de solidarité, d'entraide et de plaidoirie. Une plaidoirie est donc exigée aujourd'hui en faveur d'Haïti. Haïti qui devrait être considéré comme un musée vivant du respect des droits et du respect de la personne humaine, est devenue championne en déshumanisation. Puisque le panafricanisme est devenu un mouvement mondial à cause de la diaspora africaine, ayant en son sein des enfants africains possédant d'autres nationalités, je réclame donc aux Africains ayant de grandes voix, de bonnes voix, d'apporter les cris des Haïtiens, lamentation des Haïtiennes à la recherche de vie, la recherche de la justice et de la liberté auprès des maîtres du monde, auprès de ceux qui ont la clé de la sécurité, de la justice. Je profite de cette tribune pour remercier et féliciter le peuple haïtien qui, malgré l'absence de l'État, malgré les terroristes, malgré les catastrophes naturelles à répétition, reste debout, la tête altière et haut les fronts. Malgré les catastrophes naturelles à répétition, comme je viens de le dire, ce peuple est resté résilient et courageux. Je souhaite qu'un jour, le peuple sera divorcé de ces faux haïtiens, de ces faux politiciens, de ces faux fils, de ces faux patriotes et de ces faux amis. Le temps que lors du prochain congrès panafricain, à partir de l'action commune et unifiée panafricaniste, la voix haïtienne sera plus brillante, plus joyeuse. Vive Haïti, vive le panafricanisme. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Henri Tolzman, for your passionate address today. We wanted to make sure that the voice of Haiti is heard. Haiti is an important part of the African diaspora, being the first Black nation and republic. And it is good to have the voice of Haiti. We need more of the voice of Haiti so that the plight of our Haitian brothers and sisters can be brought to the fore and meaningful help can be offered to Haiti. We heard Mr. Tolzman calling for help for Haiti, for justice, for freedom, for economic justice as well. As a Caribbean national, sometimes I hang my head because I think of the struggles of Haiti, particularly having to deal with a lot of natural disasters. When it's not an earthquake, it's a hurricane. It seems every hurricane season that there is something else that they're dealing with. And when you stand outside, you say, why they can't be better? And then you say, they are coming from a place of great oppression from the colonial days and having to overcome all of that. And so they need the diaspora to rally around to offer meaningful assistance. We thank Mr. Tolzman for bringing to the fore the struggles of Haiti and want to affirm that Haiti is not forgotten and that we are standing with Haitians. We see the resilience of Haiti and Haitians, and we stand with you at this particular time. Coming out of this Pan-African conference, we are hoping that there could be more initiatives that will reach and embrace our Haitian brothers and sisters and make for meaningful change in that Caribbean territory. So thank you again, Mr. Tolzman, for sharing. I believe we have breakout groups now, so we would turn to the tech team to share with us how those breakout groups will go. Someone is asking for the contact for Mr. Tolzman, and I believe that we may be able to help with that at some point. Mr. Cooper Cheng.
Thank you so much, Reverend Lewis. So a slight change. The youth imagining a Pan-African future for all will not be in a breakout room. This will be part of the plenary proceedings this morning. And to chair that session will be Professor Chikane. Now it is 8:35. We are in good time. So I wonder if it is time for us to have a little break. I will be guided accordingly so that we can start at the top of the hour. Of course, please be reminded not to leave because the next session will not be in a breakout room. It will be part of these continuing proceedings. And that will be the youth section that will be chaired by Professor Chikane.
Yeah, facilitator, we will break. I think the technical team should help us. We'll break, but they should put in the link to which we will be going to. So all of us, just change of room in terms of link. but all of us will be in that group, which is plenary in our language, but another room in terms of the technical team. So if they can give us a link so that we know where we are going. If you are lost, you just go to the auditorium, and in that auditorium, you'll find the link for getting to the youth group.
Thank you so much. And I see that this session will start at 1:45, right? So we have about 10 minutes break, right? Have that cup of coffee, stretch your legs, some tea maybe, a glass of water, and in 10 minutes, we will continue. Thank you.
Yeah.
Please do not leave. This session that is coming up is an important one, particularly as we consider youth and the fact that the youth are not just the next generation, the youth are important now. We have to groom our young people to take it to the next level, to imagining a Pan-African future for all, what our young people are saying and how they play their part in ensuring that we go to the next level. It's taken quite a while from the Manchester Conference and now to move things forward. And so we need to go at a quicker pace in the next journey. And so we want to really encourage our young people. Dr. Cannon's speech earlier really was a challenging one in terms of how we work with women and helping to bring reproductive health and personhood, and how we help to dignify persons in the era. There's one statement that she made that I found very interesting when she spoke about her community in Panama, that they opened a symbolic door, as it were, back to connecting with for engagement with Africa. And I think that that is something that is crucial in our time and season for there to be those connections, those open doors. I know here in Antigua recently that they are trying to establish links between Nigeria and Antigua, where they will have flights. How soon that will take place, no one knows. But when Africa and the Caribbean connects, because we actually had the Africa and Caribbean Summit among the political leaders, but when Africa and the Caribbean connects, then we will be able to go further and do more, and we will be able to cross-fertilize. And I think that the possibilities will be endless. So we look forward to all of those connections coming down the ranks.
Reverend Lewis, this is Rehotso Fetsi speaking here as the chair for the next session. Sorry to jump in. Just wanted to remind everyone that we will be staying in this room. If you do leave, this is the room that we should come back to, or you could just leave your computers as they are and we will be good to go. Just thought I would jump in there, but thank you so much.
Could you say that again, please?
That we are all staying in this room and you can take your 5-minute break, and we will start promptly at 2:45 Central African time. But ideally don't leave this room.
Welcome back, welcome back.
Welcome back, everyone. It is so wonderful to see so many amazing faces in the room. This has been such an amazing week so far. And there's been so many people who are day-to-day attendees. Mr. Kupo-Chin, we've had certain people who've been here since day one, very loyal. I'm very interested to see their contributions for today as well. And I'm very excited to announce this panel for multiple different reasons. As a youth myself, I think it's highly important for us to have these conversations around what does it mean for young people to be building a Pan-African future for everyone. And I hope I am audible to everyone. My tech team is telling me that you can't hear me, so hopefully I am fine. Reverend Lewis, can you hear me clearly? Okay, perfect. I'm going to keep going there. So just one clarification. I am not a professor yet. I don't even know if I want to become a professor just as yet. I barely managed to become a doctor. So hopefully in December, I can hand in my thesis. But my name is Rehotsofetsi Chikane. I'm a lecturer at the Vet School of Governance, and I've been helping organize this conference for the past few days. And I'm really excited to announce this panel because we have some fantastic people on the panel with us today. So I'm going to start off with introducing two good friends, and we'll start off with Simpiwe Stewart. So Simpiwe is an Eldred Scholar at Lincoln College in Oxford and a civil society scholar through the Open Society Foundations. She holds a master's degree in environmental law, natural resources, and energy law. Prior to Oxford, she conducted research at the US Environmental Protection Agency as an ORISE research fellow in the Office of Science Policy in Washington, D.C., and the Office of Environmental Justice in Seattle, Washington. Simpiwe's research focuses on the political geography of populism. She's also interested in geographical behavior of the economic freedom fighters in South Africa, which is a political party here, and the reassemblance national in France, especially the extent to which spatio-historical politics and territorially have influenced the rise of populist electoral politics in Africa's rainbow nation and Europe's indivisible republic. It's a huge mouthful, but I know she's going to give us amazing content. We also have Fatu Wuri, who is a social justice advocate, passionate about gender equity and female leadership. She's an experienced grassroots organizer and advocate who has learned the art and science of community development firsthand in the range of cultures and settings from remote villages to the highest level of the UN. She is a respected international professional with an aptitude for innovation and joining the dots across generations, ideologies, and sectors. Fatu returned to her home country of Sierra Leone back in 2011 and was part of the first set of development specialists at the forefront of the Ebola response, working first through various channels simultaneously to bring Ebola under control. And we thank you, Fatu. There's more we could say about you, but hopefully you can give us more. Our other two panelists are Simone dos Anjos. Simone dos Anjos is a social sciences graduate from the Federal University of Sao Paulo. She has a master's in education from the University of Sao Paulo and is a PhD student in anthropology from the same university. She's also a member of the Evangelicals of Gender Equality, of the Network of Black Evangelical Women, and a member of the Independent Presbyterian Church of Brazil. And finally, but not last, we also have Mr. Hadi Yakubu. He's a collaborator and engagement leader for the Africa is Rising, a Pan-African movement mobilizing African grassroots for justice, peace, and dignity. It has over 32,000 individual and organizational members in 190 countries across Africa and the diaspora. Hadi is a Pan-Africanist organizer, a movement builder with core beliefs in social justice, the respect for human rights, and African solidarity that builds grassroots power. And I just want to say thank you so much to all our panelists. I don't even know who we begin with, but let's start off with Simpiwe, if you don't mind. Each panelist has been given 10 minutes or so. We have about an hour for this session to really talk about what it means to build a future Pan-African vision for the continent from a youthful perspective. So Ms. Stewart, if you don't mind sharing your thoughts, that would be amazing.
Hi, Rehotsofetsi. Can you hear me? Okay, very good. Yeah, so I've just prepared, I guess, the sort of introductory few remarks on my position on the particular topic. So I guess I'll start with, the definitional question, why or what is Pan-Africanism? And as I understand it, it's an ideological and spiritual striving for the liberation and unification of Africa and her people. That's Africans on the continent and in the diaspora. However, I also see it as a primarily intellectual movement or an intellectual protest, and that's the key in interrogating the place of Pan-Africanism in the future. That's the various sites of Pan-Africanist mobilization as we see them within that definition. The second issue I wanted to discuss is the issue of significance and meaning. So why the Fifth Pan-Africanist Congress? That's the Congress of 1945, which is frequently cited as a major event in the 20th century. The Congress, from my purview, is instructive for three reasons. First, it took place at the end of World War II, a war which was fought essentially over the Roosevelt administration's four essential freedoms. That's the freedom of speech, the freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Yet around the globe, hundreds of millions of people lived in colonies run by Britain, France, Holland, and other European powers. So we have African, Black, British, and African American activists coming together at that Congress. Figures like Kenya's Jomo Kenyatta, W.B. Du Bois, Kwame Nkrumah, coming together to challenge colonial powers with this Pan-Africanist determination to be free, to be educated, to earn a decent living, and to express themselves artistically and otherwise without fear. At least that's the most socio-historically sort of expedient narrative of that Fifth Congress. However, much of the striving of that Congress was for autonomy and independence of Black Africa from the monopoly of capital, the rule of private wealth, and it was this promotion of economic democracy and the pledge to fight for political, social, and economic betterment in all and every way that we can. That was really a core tenet of Pan-Africanism and African liberation. So that Congress is significant, first because it lays the foundations within an emerging world order for Africa's unification and emancipation based on education, income and jobs, expression, economic and political self-determination. But it's also instructive because of its location. So the Congress itself was held in Manchester, in Chorlton on Medlock, a town hall in England, at a time when most hotels wouldn't accept Black people, wouldn't host Black people. In fact, one of the delegates, Len Johnson, was facing a career-ending ban. He couldn't wrestle because of the color of his skin. And England, of course, at the time, consisting of some 57 colonies, was very much at the height of its imperial climb. Yet delegates met in that context to secure a place for people of African descent within the New World Order. And so the location and conditions which delegates faced should tell us about the situatedness of Pan-Africanism. It should tell us that the challenge and impetus to confront questions of colonization, of imperialism, and of the economic liberation of Africa from oppression and exploitation can and should take place in all spaces which embody Black alienation and disempowerment. So we can see that at the inception, Pan-Africanism was tied to, intellectual labor and other social movements. There are student movements, revolutionary and literary movements, and Pan-Africanism then becomes the central thesis in their advocacy for equality and for an end to injustice, in all its forms. The third and final element that I wanted to highlight are the actors in the Fifth Congress, specifically those who were not written into the popular memory, leading Black activists and liberation movement figures like Kwame Nkrumah, Kenyatta, Nyerere, Dr. Hastings Banda of Malawi, Nigerian Black male liberation figures are all listed in the popular memory of that Fifth Congress, and of course lauded for their lead role in their respective countries' struggle for independence. But there's a glaring omission there of Black women. And this is why subsequent Black anti-oppression movements consider Pan-Africanism in its historical iteration only one of three pillars of the liberation and emancipation of Africa, which is one of, so it's one of three pillars, and the other two are these concepts of Black consciousness and Black radical feminism, which are worth interrogating and worth paying attention to. And so Black radical feminism is this notion that Black women are inherently valuable, and that Black women's liberation is a necessary, not just an adjunct to Black liberation, because of the intrinsic value of Black women as human persons, as autonomous, and also as an acute embodiment, really, of the acute impacts of sexism, racism, class discrimination, and capitalist patriarchy. So the inclusion really of Black feminism as a third thing that stands out for me is also in terms of the extent to which Black feminism allows us to interrogate intersectional oppressions, and how they're aspects of the same sort of system or hierarchy that Pan-Africanism tries to rise up against. So we can think of Bell Hooks, who refers to the system as imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. We can think about Kimberly Crenshaw, who speaks about, or who wrote about the intersection of these systems and how each identity, here being Black and being female, should be considered as interacting dynamic that reveals how white supremacy and patriarchy mutually inform the experiences, particularly the experiences of Black women. And so these three issues of definition, of context, and inclusion, I think, should be central in how we view Pan-Africanist striving now and in the future, so that intellectual and ideological contestation is a necessary endeavor in the advancement of Africa and her people, and that there's a necessity for the political economy, these questions of government, of policy and finance, in the liberation of Africa and her people. The second, that there's no correct place within which these ideas should be debated or advanced. And in fact, it's the places where they haven't found relevance, where Pan-Africanist ideals should be most injected. So those places where Black alienation and disempowerment are embodied is where we should inject these ideas of decoloniality, anti-imperialist objections. And then finally, that Pan-Africanism cannot exist and will not be realized in the shadow of these three horsemen of unregulated capitalism, patriarchy, and white supremacy, rather where Black womanhood and the intersections of gender, race, and class are foundational. I hope I haven't gone too far over the time that you gave me, but I wanted to situate my following remarks in that framework. Thanks very much.
I mean, no, that was fantastic. Definitely didn't go over time. The way that you situated this understanding of Pan-Africanism, this tour de force of understanding it not just from this moment of Manchester, but the way that it evolves over time, the impediments that it faces, the challenges, the internal struggles of evading certain people from the narrative becomes hugely important when we have a gathering like this again, to make sure that A, we don't make the same mistakes of the past as ideally as possible, but how do we then, a common theme this conference has been imagining a future that is different from the past. And I think avoiding those pitfalls becomes really interesting, and knowing the particular lanes that we should take becomes even more interesting for us as we discuss how do we chart our path our path in the future. And I do want to go on to Hardy Yakubu, as someone who works on the ground in particular with Africa Rising. It'd be fantastic to hear your contributions. And I think it would create an interesting juxtaposition of sorts, not in a bad way, but something that pushes us forward and brings the discourse together. Mr. Yakubu, if you don't mind. You are still on mute, sir.
Thank you very much, Prof. I'm very happy to be here. This is a very important gathering. My boss was supposed to be here. In fact, my bosses were supposed to be here. The one who was built earlier was Lamin, who is the co-coordinator of Africans Rising. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it at the last minute due to circumstances beyond his control. And his colleague, Kumba, was supposed to be here, but she asked me to take the position because it's mainly a youth panel. And I must say that Kumba is here with us. I want to acknowledge her, her presence. This morning, while Kumba was preparing to be on this panel, we had a short chat, and she shared with me the kind of vision that she wanted to present at this conference. And I think it is very important. One of the things that has usually been missing in all the conversations that we've had is how to expand the modes of resistance that have been put forward by our forefathers and foremothers, who we take inspiration from in continuing the vision that for liberated and united Africa. I must mention that we at Africans Rising take these conversations very seriously. We just finished our All African Citizens Convening, which brought together almost 1,000 participants from all over the world, in Africa and African diaspora, to deliberate on some of these issues. But Kumba was mentioning something about how we can expand, so for instance, we do not have only a few voices, talking to ourselves and talking to the converted all the time about how to make sure that we resist the tendencies of people whose interest is only in accumulating the resources of the world to the detriment of others, or in making sure that they live in no-cost luxury, whilst the rest of us remain in abject poverty. So the work that we've been doing in Africans Rising, for instance, relates to, engaging with people on the ground and making sure that things about the economic struggles, the social justice, human rights, peace and dignity of people are upheld at the grassroots level, such that when some of these things come up, it doesn't have to be somebody at the top who would have to talk for everybody. People from the local levels and at the grassroots level would be able to raise their voices and organize themselves in such a way that their voices cannot be ignored, because it is oftentimes when these people are not involved in the conversations that we lose the great insight that happens at the grassroots level. But beyond that, we should also conceive Pan-Africanism, in my mind, to look at how we do not only resist, but also imagine recreating in our own conception. So for instance, the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester, at the venue that it was held, there were 3 flags that were hoisted. There was a flag of Haiti, there was a flag of Ethiopia, and there was a flag of Liberia. And if you analyze these flags, you would understand the interconnectedness between the struggles of African people right from time immemorial. And this is really the vision of Pan-Africanism that we subscribe to, that we are not free until we are all free. Africa cannot be free until African diaspora is free. African diaspora cannot be free until all of Africa is free. But look at the situation with Haiti, and I'm happy that there's a message on Haiti this morning, and earlier there was supposed to be a message on Cuba, because these two represent a very represent a spot in our history that highlights in one sense, the failure of our rhetoric. First, I'll take Cuba. Cuba has been building its revolution for decades now, despite very crippling sanctions by the United States of America and its allies, and in spite of vote upon vote, year upon year, at the United Nations condemning and calling on the United States to lift these sanctions, it continues to pile up all these sanctions, causing deaths in Cuba. And Cuba has held on to its revolutionary pride. Cuba has held on, giving a lot of example on how an independent, self-reliant people can build a country that does not depend on others, on the benevolence of others. And if you look at the COVID-19 pandemic in its essence, for instance, you can see how that self-reliance and independence has manifested itself, be it in the way the Cuban Medical Brigade has been sent all over the world to support other nations in their COVID-19 response, or the way Cuba has been able to build, come up with their own vaccines, not one, not two, not three, 5 vaccines. An island in Latin America, not more than 11 million people, that is capable of doing this. 54 African countries, not even one country has come up with a vaccine. I'm not saying this as a bit of a message of competition, but I'm just drawing this example to show how dedication and self-reliance can be manifested. And despite all these sanctions, crippling sanctions, criminal sanctions that the United States has heaped on Cuba all these years, it's been able to remain self-reliant. We have failed Cuba, we have failed Haiti, and Cuba has held on. In our independence struggle, Cuba was with us. Haiti has played its role right from the days of ancient times in the fight against slavery and all of that. They have been waiting patiently for us in mainland Africa to get our act together and collaborate to defeat imperialism internationally. And we have basically remained in the offices of the African Union, doing practically just talking. We need to go beyond all of this and imagine a Pan-Africanism that brings self-reliance to the fore and make sure that we strategize on the unification and liberation of the African continent, because that is where the power to withstand the shocks of the times and to make sure that the rich resources in our land are used to benefit the people rather than rich multinational companies. That is where that power is going to come from. And we cannot afford to ignore this historic moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Yakubu. You made so many interesting and valid points. This idea of self-reliance becomes deeply important. Earlier on in the conference, it was talked about how Cuba in a time of crisis for the African continent, went off and came to the continent to say, how can we assist? What fights can we fight on your behalf? And your comments around how we need to do the same become quite prevalent around when we imagine what it actually takes to create a Pan-African future that is connected for the next generation. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to go next to Ms. Dos Anjos, who will also give us her remarks. If you're with us and you take that sip of coffee and you're ready for the presentation, you can go next. Thank you so much.
Obrigada, obrigada a todos pela oportunidade de compartilhar com vocês um pouco da vivência de ser uma mulher negra no Brasil. Antes de começar o que eu preparei, eu gostaria de compartilhar com vocês uma pergunta que nós, mulheres negras, temos feito desde o dia 14 de março de 2018, que é: quem matou Marielle Franco? Eu não posso começar esse debate, essa conversa sobre a luta contra o racismo no Brasil, sem falar dessa tragédia que aconteceu e que ainda não teve explicação, né? Nós, mulheres negras no Brasil, somos as mulheres que mais sofrem com os efeitos do racismo e somos as mulheres também que estão organizadas para enfrentar o racismo no Brasil, na política, nas universidades, nas associações de bairro, no movimento da sociedade civil. Mas o que aconteceu com a Marielle Franco nos mostra o quão dura é a nossa realidade no Brasil. Quando a Marielle Franco chegou a ser uma parlamentar eleita na cidade do Rio de Janeiro, que é uma das cidades mais importantes do Brasil, economicamente, politicamente e também na cultura, ela foi assassinada por pessoas que não querem que nós, mulheres negras, estejamos nesses espaços. Então, por que eu comecei falando da Marielle Franco, né? Porque quando a gente imagina um mundo onde a África continental e todos nós, descendentes da diáspora africana, em que todos nós tenhamos a mesma qualidade de vida, acesso à educação, à moradia, à cultura, à saúde, inevitavelmente a gente tem que falar da nossa capacidade de articulação política e a nossa entrada em espaços importantes de decisão no Brasil. E quando eu penso na esperança de um futuro próximo, onde todas e todos nós, negras e negros, frutos de sequestro que aconteceram na África continental, e que viemos para cá forçadamente, navios negreiros, para sermos vendidos e explorados, isso passa pela criação de redes de luta e solidariedade. E é sobre isso que eu decidi falar hoje, sobre a rede de lutas e solidariedade entre as mulheres negras no Brasil. No Brasil, 55% da população é negra. Nós fomos a maior colônia escravagista nas Américas, com mais de 4,8 milhões de africanos que foram transportados para o Brasil e vendidos como escravos. Ao longo de mais de 3 séculos, outros 670 mil morreram no caminho, nas péssimas condições dos navios negreiros que os traficantes de escravos portugueses traziam, né, essas pessoas sequestradas. Fora os escravizados que nasceram aqui, os escravizados que não vieram de África, mas nasceram aqui, né, com a vinda desse quase 5 milhões de pessoas negras sequestradas em África. E aí o racismo, então, no Brasil, e a gente tem uma peculiaridade no Brasil, que foi uma colônia portuguesa, então a gente tem a diferença da língua com outras colônias nas Américas, né, na Mesoamérica até a América do Sul, a maioria dos países falam o espanhol, o português é falado apenas no Brasil, aqui nas Américas, e no norte, né, das Américas se fala o inglês, com maior profusão, e isso faz com que o Brasil, às vezes, tenha um isolamento na luta internacional, na luta pan-africana internacional. A barreira da língua, de fato, é uma barreira para todas as brasileiras e brasileiros. É por isso que também eu optei por fazer a minha fala em português, porque muitas das pessoas brasileiras que estão assistindo esse painel não falam ou inglês ou espanhol, porque a educação no Brasil é uma barreira. A educação no Brasil, para as pessoas negras, que são as mais pobres, ela é uma dificuldade, né? Nesse mês de novembro agora, é um mês super importante para o movimento negro no Brasil. É marcado pelo Dia de Lutas por Igualdade Racial no Brasil, o Dia do Zumbi dos Palmares, um dia muito importante para nós afrodiaspóricos brasileiros. É um dia de luta pela nossa memória, e essa é uma disputa que acontece no Brasil. A disputa por contar uma história que não seja única, mas que contemple o nosso povo e a nossa trajetória aqui na terra brasileira. Então, esse é o primeiro ponto, quando eu imagino um panafricanismo, né, em que todas as pessoas negras tenham acesso à qualidade de vida, é o direito à memória. No Brasil, durante muito tempo, o direito à memória nos foi roubado. Durante muito tempo, nós não tivemos o direito à memória. E essa é uma disputa que nós temos feito. Como contar a nossa história? Eu não posso falar de escravização no Brasil sem citar uma série de negras e negros que lutaram contra a escravização de pessoas no Brasil, que lutaram contra a exploração econômica e física das pessoas negras no Brasil. Eu não posso falar de luta antirracista no Brasil, achando que esse é um fenômeno recente na nossa terra. Eu não posso deixar de falar de Luísa Maim, de Dandara, Aqualtune de Palmares, Felipa do Pará, Zumbi dos Palmares, que foram figuras importantíssimas na resistência à escravização no Brasil. E isso nos traz esperança. Quando o povo negro no Brasil começou a ter acesso aos nomes importantes da luta contra o racismo, como o advogado Luiz Gama, que foi um negro ex-escravizado, que foi o maior advogado abolicionista que teve no Brasil. Então, quando nós estamos pensando nisso, no direito à memória é super importante. E esse foi um marco importante na luta do movimento negro, que foi o sancionamento de uma lei que obriga o ensino de história da África nas escolas. O direito à memória é importante para esse mundo futuro que a gente imagina, um panafricanismo para todas as pessoas. É quando a gente ensina nas escolas que as nossas crianças muitas vezes não sabem que a África é um continente. Muitas vezes as nossas crianças pretas da periferia acham que a África é um país. Muitas vezes as nossas crianças nas periferias do Brasil não entendem a capacidade cultural, econômica, política e tecnológica e científica que existe em África. Então, aproximar, né, a memória do nosso povo preto no Brasil, que é 55% da população, né? O Brasil é o país mais negro fora de África. E muitas vezes nós não temos acesso à memória. Então, quando eu imagino uma África para todas as pessoas, um panafricanismo para todas as pessoas negras, eu imagino no direito à memória. E aqui eu quero falar muito da Marcha de Mulheres Negras, que aconteceu em 2015 no Brasil. Eu vou colocar no chat aqui o link da nossa carta, para quem quiser ter acesso. A Marcha das Mulheres Negras no Brasil, ela tomou Brasília, que é a capital do país, levou 50 mil mulheres para Brasília para reivindicar a memória e para reivindicar uma nova gestão da coletividade, uma nova gestão dos recursos públicos, que privilegie todas as pessoas, em que todas as pessoas tenham acesso ao bem viver. E o bem viver aqui para as mulheres negras no Brasil é extremamente importante. É uma filosofia das ameríndias, ou seja, dos povos originários da América, em que o bem viver é aquela filosofia em que todas as pessoas vivem e vivem bem. E o que acontece no Brasil hoje é que as pessoas negras sobrevivem, elas não vivem, elas não têm qualidade de vida. Eu quero falar que não dá, então, para a gente falar de diáspora africana no Brasil sem falar desses mais de 300 anos de escravização do povo negro. E isso tem impacto na pobreza do país. Por conta das novelas brasileiras, há uma falsa impressão de que o Brasil é branco, mas não é, o Brasil é negro, e nós temos que recuperar essa história. Em 1985, no terceiro encontro de feministas latino-americanas do Caribe, que aconteceu em Bertioga, litoral de São Paulo, mulheres negras se reuniam e planejavam uma nova estrutura social, uma nova gestão do bem público brasileiro. A maioria dessas mulheres, elas vêm de uma vivência de sofrimento, de exclusão e marginalização, como Beatriz Nascimento, como Lélia Gonzalez, Carolina Maria de Jesus e tantas outras mulheres negras que foram importantíssimas para que hoje eu, Simone dos Anjos, estivesse na universidade e estivesse aqui conversando com vocês. Um segundo ponto, quando eu imagino um panafricanismo para todas as pessoas, que inclua inclusive as pessoas brasileiras, é uma luta histórica do movimento negro aqui no Brasil, que é a luta por cotas nas universidades. Em 2019, foi a primeira vez que nós tivemos mais de 50% de pessoas negras dentro das universidades públicas. Até 2019, a maioria das pessoas que estavam nas universidades públicas brasileiras, que são as melhores universidades do Brasil, eram pessoas brancas. Ou seja, proporcionalmente, os negros entravam muito menos na universidade. E com as políticas reparatórias, com as políticas de inclusão de pessoas negras dentro das universidades, nós hoje temos uma outra possibilidade de futuro para os jovens negros no Brasil. Um futuro, vou falar mais devagar, um futuro onde as pessoas negras possam, de fato, terem acesso à educação, à saúde, à cultura e a uma vida digna. Para concluir a minha fala, após essas políticas reparatórias que fizeram com que muitos jovens entrassem nas universidades, queria dizer que não é uma luta fácil e não são mudanças estruturais fáceis. No Brasil, está em curso o genocídio da população negra. O que é o genocídio da população negra? Hoje, a cada 23 minutos, um jovem negro é assassinado pela polícia no Brasil. E isso faz parte de um esforço para que as pessoas negras não alcancem espaços de decisão e de poder no Brasil. E já concluindo a minha fala, eu quero dizer que a pandemia nos mostrou que nós temos um longo caminho a percorrer. As pessoas que mais morreram por Covid no Brasil foram as pessoas negras e principalmente as mulheres negras, que têm os trabalhos mais precários. E o movimento de mulheres negras no Brasil acredita que temos um projeto político para o Brasil, um projeto que preze pelo bem viver, é um projeto que sustenta na vida boa para todas as pessoas, com a distribuição de renda, moradia, educação, saúde e cultura e o combate aos efeitos do capitalismo. É necessário uma outra economia para que os jovens negros da periferia do mundo, de fato, possam viver com qualidade. Obrigada.
Thank you so much for that, Mr. Dos Anjos, and I hope I'm saying that correctly. I mean, you made such an important contribution around the right to memory. And I think it's deeply important because often if we don't remember, where we came from, where we are presently, it's impossible to imagine where we can go in the future without having someone else telling us how we should go about it. And I just want to thank you about that. And I am going to ask you a question later, but I'm going to hold myself back so that we can go to Ms. Fatu Ruri, who also will give us her contributions. And then we'll have a nice question and answer session with all the panelists. and get some questions from the crowd as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, colleagues, friends. So much has been said, such richness, from just a wonderful overview that really grounds this conversation to a reminder that we must be as inclusive as possible, to what I just heard in the summary around memory. We have a saying in my country, if you don't know where you're going, know from where you come. And part of this disruption has been to erase our story. So thank you for this. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you, everyone, for the invitation to share my thoughts in the next 10 minutes or so, and the future of Pan-Africanism as a young Black African woman. I don't know how young I am and what the age limit is, but youngish. My 4-year-old self is quite excited to be here. I grew up in such a pro-Black, pro-African home, and that is a foundation that helped me navigate racism and sexism and displacement as I spent my childhood and teens living in over 20 countries where my very presence and embodiment was perceived as a threat, often othered, often made to feel less than. It is my identity rooted in Pan-Africanist teachings and principles is what kept me grounded until I returned back home to my country of Sierra Leone a couple of years ago. She or he who feels it knows it. A few years ago, upon returning to Sierra Leone, I built a community network to support female survivors of Ebola during the West African Ebola virus disease outbreak. And we ran sessions from the educational to the professional and the psychosocial. Whenever a woman in one of the sessions would become overwhelmed with emotion before, after, or even mid-session, all the women in the group would instantly stop, surround her, look at her, and say, she who feels it knows it. This really goes back to the beginning of this conversation where we were really situated and grounded in why the 5th Pan-Africanist Congress is so important and symbolic, being held in Manchester in 1945. Of course, it occurred at a unique height of collective pan-Black anger, triggering unprecedented pan-Black unity under a single idea. The single ideology fueled unions, resolutions, movements, boycotts, protests, and wars that have afforded us the progress we benefit from today. Thank you, Pan-Africanism. They who felt it knew it. The paradigm shifts achieved in Manchester 76 years ago is unquantifiable. However, with every resistance, there must be a counter-resistance. Within the context of exploitative and extractive foreign governments, let's summarize this and call it colonialism, the delegations of the Pan-African Congress placed emphasis on political ownership and self-governance for Africa and the African diaspora as the focus of Pan-Africanism from the 1940s to the 1990s. North American and European colonial forces countered that by disrupting regional and global alliances that were working for collective political and social economic autonomy, waging proxy wars to prop up puppet leaders, supporting economic imperialism, and really sowing strong divisive narratives between us. And an example I have is being a teenager in the 90s, going to high school in the US, and having African Americans refer to me as the African booty scratcher. Thank God it is now cool to be African again. Each one of these counter movements have become a self-fulfilling prophecy, and we see it today. George Floyd, Sheku Bayo, victims of Afrophobia killings in South Africa, victims of the End SARS protests in Nigeria, victims of abduction and femicide in Lavender Hill, and the entirety of Haitian, Trini, and Jamaican politics today. And yes, Kumba, viva Mariela Franco. Each of these tragedies are inextricably linked to my freedom and your freedom, to my future and your future. That is the reality of Pan-Africanism today, and also how Pan-Africanism and its principles can liberate us presently and even more so in the future. Akin to 1945, when all of our uncles were angry about being lied to regarding what would happen if we fought in World War II. And just like the 1960s, when our aunties were being killed daily for boycotting in rice fields in Senegal and on buses in Alabama, we find ourselves yet again uniquely angry. We are angry at Haitian migrants being housed, caged, and flown to war zones against international law. We are angry at Breonna Taylor's wrongful death for which we have seen no justice. And we're angry about our lost sisters missing from Lavender Hill with no government action, let alone justice. We're angry that in the middle of a global pandemic, we took to the streets to affirm that Black lives matter all over cities in the US, Europe, Asia, and Africa. And yet Indigenous and Black peoples are disproportionately affected by COVID. And today in Africa, only 2% of our population is vaccinated due to hoarding by rich countries, lack of equitable distribution. If we aren't dying in the streets, we are dying in hospitals or of poverty or of injustice. This anger is our understanding that our shared history inextricably links our present, our hopes, our destinies, and our futures for potential freedom. I am not free until the poorest, youngest, transsexual, Black girl, Black boy in every urban, rural town across Black communities is free. And we who continue to feel it, continue to know it. I've worked in the space of global development and systems of multilateralism for a very long time. And the future I envision for Pan-Africanism holds two key codependent truths. First, the fresh face of Pan-Africanism is now embodying an all-inclusive narrative that extends to all Black women, the poorest women, rural women and girls, Black people with disabilities, the Black LGBTQI community, every auntie, every uncle, and every even annoying cousin. There were no women, rural populations, LGBTQI community members, or vulnerable persons at the Pan-African Congress. Or if they were, we really don't know their names. The educated elite men of the Pan-African Congress envisioned what was most pressing and critical for us then, which is anti-colonialism. Yet Pan-Africanism's rival today is imperialism. It benefits our African leaders. Today's Pan-Africanism and tomorrow's Pan-Africanism must elect, support, and keep in power leaders from all Black demographics, especially the most disfranchised members of our communities, redistributing power from a select few to one that is accessible to all. This can most effectively be done through pan-Black coalitions that reallocate, reimagine, and redefine political decision-making from one of economic dependency on the global North to one of collective self-reliance and accountability. This actually leads me to think about, once again, COVID and the world we're living in, thinking about if we had actually invested and we're able to invest in building our own research and development ecosystem on the continent and our own indigenous pharmaceutical industry, we would not be at the mercy of global forces today. My second key point here is economics. We must become economically liberated. The 21st century is characterized by a lack of Pan-African and African diaspora trade and economic codependency, Pan-African financial glass ceilings, the weak Black and Pan-African ownership of our own economic and financial independence. For example, Nigeria's biggest Afrobeat stars are leaving local record labels that they've helped build from the ground up to now sign up with Warner Music and UGM, trading ownership and generational wealth for Western listeners for many, many reasons. I cannot simplify it to just, How do we counter this? In an increasingly globalizing capitalist market, Pan-African and African diasporic political autonomy and trade will be crucial to lift us out of debt, rural poverty, and the aid complex crisis. Not only is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement one of the most significant steps towards a Pan-African future, it is also the very basis for the sort of pan-Black and even further Black Atlantic trade that we need to foster. Building off this movement, Afri-Exim Bank and the government of Barbados signed a milestone memorandum of understanding to expand trade and investment between Africa and the Caribbean country earlier this month. Both the bank and the Prime Minister of Barbados have stressed the region's shared history as part of their impetus for the MOU, with the goals to harness the power of trade to create new jobs, scale up new industries, and reap the benefits of a rich exchange in goods, services, and cultures between Africa and Barbados. I shared this example to drive home the point that when Black people trade and invest in Black people, the results include economic wealth and benefits that resonate and reach the most hard-to-reach areas in job creation and in economic empowerment, which often coincides with political empowerment and decision-making. Pan-Black economic trade and support driven by the ideals of Pan-Africanism reaching every shape and size, creed, color, and contour of the Black race is the future of Pan-Africanism. So we must remember that today we have to address systemic, psychological, religious, cultural, and structural oppression that perpetuates exclusion, poverty, and regressive policies that further expose our people to violence in every corner and facet of their lives. We are the generation that can and have to and will uproot anti-Black racism and its deeply entrenched political and socioeconomic forces that hinder our collective well-being globally for Black and Indigenous people globally. We have the baton. I think I really appreciate Kumba's comment when she says we take the leadership of the youth. We're not the future, we're not the leaders of tomorrow, we're the leaders of today. And we have the baton that is already filled with knowledge, filled with grace, filled with energy, filled with resources. I believe that we will continue to build, and we will have to continue to build global, regional, national, and community-based coalitions for Black joy. We are today's leaders. We who feel it, we know it. Thank you.
Thanks so much for such a powerful address. It got me thinking, and we've got about 10 minutes or so for question and answers. So if you do have any questions, put it in the chat or put it in the question and answers, and we'll make sure we get to it. And for me, the first point is that you were talking about a counter movement. And I was reflecting back on myself and the idea that as someone who was part of a counter movement and then ended up in the back of a police van because you're a part of it, it almost becomes demoralizing that you're fighting for a better future, but the world seems to just impact you. And I'm thinking about your comment with Simpiwa's address as well. So I do want to ask Ms. Stewart first, if she doesn't mind, just this notion of how do we, based on what we know from the past, avoiding the pitfalls, the advice you would give to those who do want to build a movement that pushes against those who don't want us to create a Pan-African future. What would be your advice around the steps we should take to avoid pitfalls and embrace the opportunities?
Thanks, Rakotsofetse. I know why you're asking me that question. So I will start by acknowledging that last year we were part of a tradition started by Rakotsofetse and his cohort at the University of Oxford, calling for the decolonization of the university through the Rhodes Must Fall in Oxford movement. And that movement, like I mentioned in my opening remarks, is really around sites of anti-imperialist, anti-white supremacist protest. So it's not just Pan-Africanism in the economy or Pan-Africanism in terms of general liberation, but really Pan-Africanism where you are, that sort of site of protest matters. And for us, the site of protest was the University of Oxford. I think by way of advice, the most resounding sort of call, the most resounding value that I can speak to is this idea of a return of Africa and a return to Africa. So when we talk about a return to Africa, i-Africa maibuye, it's not just a return physically in terms of bodies migrating to Africa, but it's also a return to African logics and African logics that contest neoliberal white supremacist logics. So from where you are, really interrogating and not uncritically venerating white logics, which speak to, for example, this question in the political economy around what resources are, how and under what conditions a resource can be exploited, extraction of resources, extraction of knowledge. There's a NAP ministry on Instagram that speaks to anti-white supremacist values in terms of rest. And so I think the greatest advice really is just in terms of centering one's anti-oppression activism in terms of i-Africa maibuye, a return to African logics. And I should mention also that the question of governance is a real question once Pan-Africanism is achieved, because, and Cuba is a great example, we can't have Pan-Africanism, we can't achieve Pan-Africanism without reimagining what a Pan-Africanist governance system looks like, when in fact, much of the systems that we are in right now, including in Africa, where democracy nominally at least is the order, really considering what breaking away from white supremacist logics looks like across contexts. Thanks.
No, thanks for that. And we do have a question in the chat, and I think that one of the best people to answer this, and then we'll go to Simone, is Mr. Yakubu. The question there, based off your organization, just how do you get young voices into spaces where decisions are made? How do we stop young voices being marginalized? Now, we do have about 4 or 5 minutes, and I do want to be able to get everyone to wrap up. So in your words, how would we do that in about a minute or so? It's far too short.
Thank you very much. I think it is first of all recognizing that the sort of model that our leaders currently are running, it's completely outmoded. How to get young people, into decision-making processes is about imagining how to leverage the levers of power, because all of these has to be narrowed down to how these brilliant ideas that we all have then translate into concrete Pan-African processes that bring about the unity and liberation that we all speak of. So we have to have the strategy to, first of all, raise the awareness, to secondly, raise the funding. I think that one of the things that we ought to do, and do very, very, very strategically, is to probably make sure that we get strategic individuals in all these African countries, entering into parliament or contesting in some form of election and getting into the process. That's the only way that we can find our voices in the rooms where decisions are being made. And once those voices are there, we would be represented, and the views and the views and ideas of Pan-Africanism would not be in the fringes. They would actually be represented in decision making, and we can have a future that is based on these ideals, rather than basically talking about ourselves.
No, thanks for that so much. I mean, it's hugely important. And I know myself that there's different ways of getting into Parliament, but sometimes those spaces aren't the places where real decisions are made. And sometimes you need to create them yourself. Now we have a couple more minutes left, and I'm going to cheat. And I'm going to ask a question, but also ask the last two panelists to give their final concluding thoughts. Unfortunately, we won't be able to hear from Ms. Stewart and Mr. Yakubu, but just there's a question in the chat, which I think is deeply important. So just in 30 seconds, from your perspective, if you had the opportunity to understand how to disseminate your training, your experience around activism, around change, what would be your advice to other young activists who are in the room or who are listening around from the lessons you've learned, what is the advice that you can give and disseminate to other people? Just in 30 seconds each. We can start with Ms. Dos Anjos.
Bom, eu posso começar. Eu sempre falo, volte para suas bases. Por que volte para suas bases? Muito parecido com a minha trajetória, nós, jovens líderes negros, que furamos as barreiras do racismo, alcançamos as universidades, alcançamos espaços de poder, muitas vezes acabamos sendo empurrados para fora de onde nós viemos. Então, voltar para o território, pisar no território, estar onde nós nos originamos e trazer conosco mais jovens, incentivar mais jovens. Aqui em Osasco, eu fui candidata a prefeita na minha cidade, fui a 4ª pessoa mais votada, única mulher negra candidata, e fizemos esse debate de racismo na cidade nas eleições, e depois criaram um cursinho popular para acessar o ensino universitário chamado Simone dos Anjos. Isso, para mim, foi a prova de que voltar para o território vale a pena. Disputar espaços de decisão no seu território, de onde você saiu, vale a pena. Então, hoje existem 100 jovens estudando no cursinho que chama Simone dos Anjos, e isso, para mim, é muito potente. Então, sempre lembrar de onde a gente veio, voltar para o território, para mim, é a dica para a gente construir o mundo que a gente quer. E muito obrigada pela oportunidade de trocar algumas ideias aqui, que nós tenhamos um 2022 muito melhor para todos nós, de esperança, de luta e de memória. Obrigada.
I would want the 2023 for the token memories as well. Ms. Buri, if you don't mind going next in 30 seconds.
Can I do 30 seconds? Look, every time I get asked this question, I don't even know how to, it's a lot, but I'll distill it to what has been important for me. And looking back when I was in my 20s and I started protesting, I started my own, finding my own voice on the streets. That's how I started. And I remember it was in that I was able to meet other like-minded people who were, of all generations. When you're thinking about sort of this generational linkage, it was through protest, it was through mobilization, community-based mobilizing, door to door. There wasn't this hip, big media thing. Social media rave at the time. It was in those circles that I was able to feel affirmed that my anger, whether it's righteous or not, or untamed or whatever it was powerful and needed. So I feel as though first thing that's really important is that everyone is affirmed and that their role in this movement, in this bigger vision, matters. From those that are protesting on the streets, to those that are in the boardrooms, to those that are raising money and have the resources, to those that are working to be in parliament. Everyone has a role to play. And I think our biggest goal is to be able to get people to mobilize and to talk to one another. It's so important to affirm, because that is what builds the bridge. That is what builds the confidence to say, I'm going to go and learn, and to de-intellectualize it. Because the only way I understood terms like, these very technical terms that we often, we're elites and very privileged African and Black peoples sitting in certain institutions, using certain words and language to intellectualize the feeling that we have. This lack of dignity, this displacement, this pain can be intellectualized in very refined language. But how do we make sure that those of us that are protesting in Oxford recognize that there's a way in which we have to make that bridge and that link to those that are protesting in slum communities, in impoverished areas? To me, that's what absolutely matters. just to summarize, that we are affirming and seeing every single person's contribution as worthy, and that we are also really doing the work to recognize our own internalized notions and abilities and positionalities of power and privilege, and we're collaborating and coordinating and coalition building, and the learning becomes circular, the money becomes circular, the narrative becomes a lot more refined. So that would be my more than 30 seconds feedback. Over.
The people behind the scenes are whispering in my ear to say we must move on. It is a perfect segue though. The last 2 points. The first one around that we need to build connections. The next breakaway, we have 2 breakaway rooms next, and 2 of them touch on the issues that we talked about here. And one of them is around the idea of how do you build a feminist Pan-African future as well, right? So how do we make sure we don't repeat the mistakes of the past of erasing certain bodies, erasing certain histories? And the other breakaway that we have is on how do we build Pan-African connections? And we have a whole host of amazing speakers ready to impart their knowledge with you. We're going to take a 10-minute break. You'll see the links for the breakaways in the chat. It should be popping up now. So take 10 minutes. Find the group that you want to be part of. If you don't find the link in the chat, you can also find it on the website, right? If you go to the website and you go to the auditorium, you'll find the different links for the particular sessions. They will be starting promptly at 4 o'clock. So please get some coffee, get some water, take a walk. We have 2 amazing breakaways for you. You can pick and choose which one you would like to go to. Thank you so much, and thank you to all the speakers today.